Okay, and I believe that we are live. Good morning to everyone joining us from the US, and good afternoon to those joining us from Europe. And a special welcome to those who have already joined us in 1 week sessions yesterday. We are very happy to see you coming back for more. My name is Nia, and I'm part of the Customer Success Team and Quorum's EU branch situated in Brussels, Belgium, which is also where I'm joining you from today. I will tell you a bit more about our session today, as well as give the floor to our speakers shortly. But first, we'd like to waste just a couple of minutes to give everyone the opportunity to log on, give a little extra time to those who might still be waiting on their coffee to be done. We know this is a bit of an early start for some of you. And while we do that, we wanted to offer you a little icebreaker to pass the time and get everyone going. And with staying with the theme of today's discussion on differences in approaches across the Atlantic, the question we would like to ask you is, which condiment do you prefer with your fries, ketchup or mayonnaise? A seemingly innocent question, but possibly a very controversial one. So please feel free to jot down your response in the chat window, which should be located on the right-hand side of your screen under a little chat icon. As a heads up, we will also be using the chat function for the Q&A portion of the session a bit later on. So I would encourage you to already try to make yourself a little familiar with it. And all right, while we wait for the responses to come in, Joao and Nick, I would also be interested in hearing what your take is on this.
Ooh, neither. I don't like ketchup or mayo.
Wild card answer there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very Belgian at this point in time, so I would definitely go for mayonnaise.
Yeah. All right, we have some responses coming in. Oh, and it looks like a lot of people are showing support for mixing both of them together and finding an interim solution. We should keep this in the back of my mind. This might come in as a great metaphor for our discussion at some point later on. Belgian fries good, Belgian condiments bad. Belgian weather even worse, I would say.
I do smuggle in Chick-fil-A sauce from America for my fries, so I have it literally shipped in. So.
Wow, the struggles of expat living.
Exactly.
This seems to be a very uncontroversial and inclusive crowd we have, very open-minded, which should be very good for the discussion going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Any other points?
This is the most perhaps tense question you will ask during this session. Huh?
Probably, it definitely could be. But I feel like a lot of people before they come to here don't even realize the possibility that mayonnaise is an option. I think that was also the case for me.
That's funny. Yes, it's the condiments even at like McDonald's are different in Europe than they are in the US. So you can go and think you're gonna get one thing and you're gonna get something completely different.
And a lot of controversy about apparently having to pay for condiments in McDonald's from the US colleagues is something that I also hear a lot. Yep. So far it's been pretty 50-50, so we'll see. Maybe more responses continue to come in and we can declare a winner towards the very end. But for now, I see that a few more people have joined in, hopefully with coffees at hand. So I think we can now circle back to our topic of discussion, which is, it doesn't work like that in Brussels. If you're in EU affairs, you've likely said that to your US colleagues. Or if you're lobbying in DC, you've probably been on the receiving end of that sentence, which leaves you wondering why Brussels is so different, apart from, of course, putting mayonnaise on fries. So it's time for the cities to go head to head. What do EU affairs professionals wish their counterparts on the Hill understood about Brussels, and what could they both learn from each other? Joining us today to explore this topic are Nick DeSarno, Director of Digital and Policy Communications at Public Affairs Council, and João Sousa, Managing Director of the European Office of the Public Affairs Council. I will let them tell you more about their accolades and experience, as well as their initial thoughts on the topic themselves in their opening remarks. So with no further ado, João, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Nia, and thanks to Quorum for the invitation. Thanks to everyone who is attending and who share their thoughts on probably the most controversial question about European politics. Everything else is relatively straightforward, but but this one is a really tricky one. So as Nia mentioned, my name is Jean Souza. I manage the Public Affairs Council's European office, as well as our international practice, which puts me in an interesting position of being a little bit between the two continents, which is, I think, really fascinating, because I get to be in contact with bright minds from both sides of the pond. The Public Affairs Council, for those of you who don't know us, is a global association for public affairs professionals. We have around 700 member plus globally, from Fortune 500 companies to associations in Europe and the US, to consulting firms. And we provide executive education and peer-to-peer discussions and networking opportunities for those companies and for their staff, which is upwards of 10,000 people globally. So that's a bit about me, a bit about the council. Before I was in the council, I joined 4 years ago. I was working with the European Union, and I was a consultant in places as diverse as Brussels, as Bucharest in Romania, Kosovo, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, The Hague, right next door, Portugal. So quite a bit of traveling there. And now I settled in Brussels, which is the city of the great weather. So that's a little bit about me. Over to you.
Over to you, Nick.
Awesome. Again, big thanks to Nia and to Quorum for inviting us. I'm Nick DeSarno, and I work normally in our DC office for the Public Affairs Council. I'm actually located in London. I live in the UK for the last 3 years, so I kind of have a little bit of experience both with US politics and now in the EU. We worked levels of government. I worked for a mayor, a state senator, and a U.S. congressman. And so kind of gave me a lot of breadth and understanding how the political system works and the legislative system works. I've worked on campaigns, legislative offices as well. So, just kind of thinking about this question is something that we get asked a lot about, mainly from the U.S. perspective of we are a large company based in the U.S. We're starting to do business more and more in Europe. Do we need an office in Brussels? Do we need, what does that look like? How is it different? However, more and more as, our, two continents become more united, especially recently over the war in Ukraine, a lot of European companies also want to understand how the U.S. works and oftentimes will create offices or a U.S. government relations function. It's obviously very different. I think is better or more easier to work with, but they all have their kind of unique differences and strategies, tactics that you can use, which is something that I really find interesting, and I'm always curious to see what might work that we do in the U.S., what might work in the EU, or vice versa. What are they doing really well in the EU that we can maybe take and modify for a U.S. audience?
Thank you for that. So as you said, there's definitely good practices to learn from on both sides of the pond. But before those practices can be shared, I think a lot comes to gauging expectations on initial greeting and initial interaction. So maybe to start off from that, maybe from an European perspective, and then maybe we'll move on to the US one shortly. A question I have for Joao: what are some of the biggest misconceptions that US public affairs teams tend to have when they arrive in Brussels and try to establish a more so EU presence? And are there any of these misconceptions in particular that stand out to your mind that can lead to real no-nos when it comes to lobbying in Europe?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and yes, a question that we get a lot from U.S. companies that are interested in doing public affairs in Europe, in setting up teams here, and interested in getting in the European market, but also realizing the importance of the EU as a policy trendsetter, the so-called Brussels effect. It's something that is increasingly recognized, and companies are realizing that if you want to be ahead of the game on things like sustainability, on things like energy efficiency, on climate change, the green package, the Green Deal, Brussels is really a place where you need to be, and you need to have a strong presence. So to your question about misconceptions, I think perhaps one of the main misconceptions is that Brussels is like Washington, D.C. And this is going away more and more, but certainly the two cities are very different animals. They are two very big, large public affairs capitals globally, but they function in very different ways, of course. The institutional setup is very different. Brussels is a very technical city. It is becoming more and more political, and perhaps we're gonna get to this at a later stage. But it's still a very technical city. It's still pumping legislation very, very actively. So you need, as a public affairs team that comes from let's say a Washington or a US background, you need to understand that Brussels is a more technical city. You need to understand that you need to get in the game early on, and you cannot mistaken access with influence. That's a saying that I heard a couple of years ago, and that sometimes, especially U.S. companies, sometimes confuse access with influence. But it's not the same thing. You can have access to the EU commissioner, to the political appointee, but that does not mean that that access is going to translate in you actually influencing the policy-making process. Because oftentimes in Brussels, the policy-making process is being stirred on a daily basis by the policy officer that has that desk on his, or that file on his or her desk. So I think that's one important misconception. And perhaps the other one that I would mention here, and it goes to a similar point, is the fact that Europe is made up not just of Brussels, which is indeed the policy hub, but also of 27 capitals. And those capitals are really the political masters of the European Union. So, what happens in Berlin, what happens in Rome, I was going to say London, but I won't say London anymore. What happens in Paris and in Scandinavian capitals, that is really the political direction that the European Union has taken, decided at the European Council, decided in everyday political life within those capitals, and that's important for international companies, for US companies to be aware. It does not mean that you're going to have teams in every single capital, of course. You can use your Brussels office as a hub in Europe, and then figure out, according to your needs and resources, how you're going to follow the capitals. But it is important to be aware that member states have a very big weight in the way EU does politics and does legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, João. Nick, would you like to elaborate a little bit based on your experience from the US perspective, what has been dealing with lobbying for US actors, the EU in particular, when it comes to this focus of technical versus more political, and of access as an equal influence, or even through maybe how the understanding of the influence of member states level translates?
Yeah, I think it's obviously very complex, right? Because in the US, we have this federated kind of system, and there is something similar obviously going on in the EU, but it's just vastly different. And so some of the levers that you would push in DC or in state capitals, even in the US, you just don't have those options in Brussels or in some of those state capital or some of the country capitals. I would also say that overall, I think that I think DC is becoming less political in a lot of ways. That is obviously, it's still very divisive. but I think people overstate sometimes how political the U.S. is. But it is remarkably different when we go to Brussels, and so there are definitely bureaucrats and a whole institution. A lot of usually it's very staff heavy as well when you go to Brussels. Those people have usually several degrees. They're highly educated Europeans. They speak several languages. Almost everyone in Brussels makes me look foolish, and so it can kind of be intimidating to come in there, especially if you're from American company, and say, we really think this is the policy that would be the most effective to make Europe competitive. Those types of things are sometimes really difficult, and so they have to lean on their European partners. I would say that some of the misconceptions that we get often is that it's really slow. In the EU, and obviously the US has also been currently pretty slow. States move very quickly still in the US in comparison. I think that's also changing when you look at how big the issues the EU is tackling. They're not necessarily tackling, things that it would be dealt upon, at a country level, a member state level. They're dealing with like some massive issues like climate change, that are going to take years to finalize in terms of policy. And so I think if you look at in that perspective, it's not actually slow, it's that their issues are just much larger. When you look at antitrust that they're dealing with right now, EU is really leading the world there. They are holding a lot of the tech companies to fire, their feet to fire right now. Even just something as simple as they're making standard in the EU so that iPhone cannot keep changing, what cord they use to charge your iPhone. That is going to have a huge effect. We will probably end up in the US using the same cords that the EU has mandated. So like Joao said, it is often the EU that leads on a lot of these critical issues. And so even if you don't have a huge marketplace there, it might end up really affecting your company in the long run or your association.
And is there a bit of a learning curve or growing pains when it comes for US companies learning to how to lobby and work with more larger packages that you say that the EU is dealing with? And would you have any kind of recommendations or tips on how to manage that transition?
Yeah, and I'll let Joao speak for the majority of this because he's the expert there. But 100%, there's a lot of great firms that do work in the EU. It is definitely, I would say, in the US, you would often hire folks based on their relationships, and that is true in the EU as well, but more so on their expertise and the ability to be seen as credible and authentic as a leader on that policy issue. Whereas often you can hire someone in the US that just has previously worked in that the leadership's office or those types of things. The US is also kind of, I think, changing there, and we are becoming more policy oriented in that respect. Lobbyists are no longer just kind of in the revolving door, just coming back in every other cycle. They are developing issue area expertise more in the US now as well. But I think that's a remarkable difference of can you really go into that office with credibility? I think is bigger in the EU than in the US.
Yes. Joao, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Nick made some very good points. I do agree that it's when you come to Europe, when you are in Europe, it's certainly a good thing to have at least a basic understanding of how the EU machinery works, and we've talked about that here a little bit. The EU is a big ship, and so when you're trying to influence the course of a big ship, you need to do so from the early stages of the process. If you try to do that while the ship is well in high seas, then it's going to be much more difficult. So getting the timing right is definitely important. But so, having a basic understanding of the process, and then certainly find your allies, and find people and associations and consulting firms you can work with. Nick is very right when he mentioned the importance of not just of networking lobbyists, if that name exists, and I did hear it, the name networking lobbyists versus knowledge lobbyists. So for the sake of convenience, let's use that distinction, even though in practice the same person can very much have both characteristics. But in Brussels especially, it's important to have someone, or to have a consulting firm, or more than one. Actually, you see many US companies in Brussels who have more than one consulting firm helping them in different ways. It's definitely a good thing to have the kind of technical expertise, just because the output is just so large, and it's really a full-time thing. Perhaps another point that I would add is that think not just in terms of consulting firms, but also in terms of associations. And this, I would say that it's almost cultural in Europe, and in many countries, associations are actually part of the country's ecosystem. Associations, syndicates in places like Germany, or like France, or many other countries. These organizations are really, really powerful. And so working with industry associations or trade associations, whether you're in tech or in pharma or whatever your sector, chemicals, whatever your sector might be, there are most likely more than one association that you can, be members of, be active in. And that usually, I say usually, not always, but usually encounters a favorable ear from the European institutions, because they will have the perception, oftentimes, right, that they are speaking to the industry and not to the interests of one specific organization. So whenever possible, think in terms of coalitions, think in terms of partnerships, and I think you'll find that the most successful companies do that.
100%. I think it's very hard for an individual company in the EU to make a huge impact on a piece of legislation or policy. It's much easier for associations, and they're viewed very differently, like Joelle mentioned. Our associations can be viewed as fairly political, where it's almost like in the Europe, it seems like those associations are like think tanks would be in the US. Slightly, more impartial than just representing, a smaller, sect of an industry position.
And Nick, I wanted to get to you with my next question. In terms, Josh just outlined to us, and as well you agreed, some great practices of terms things should be kept top of mind when approaching public affairs in the EU, and mostly importance of partnerships, whether it's with consultants and associations. In a similar vein, what are some of the key aspects that you say that European companies need to be aware of when trying to lobby successfully in the DC, so the opposite side of the coin?
Yeah, and I'm going to take the chance to, I saw a question come in about, can you explain why you believe the US is perceived as less political? I think, often Europeans view the US as so political because that's the knowledge that, that's the information that they're getting, that they think that they can kind of come over, maybe launch a political action committee, write a bunch of checks to politicians, and then their policy issues solved. It does not work like that. While companies do have the ability to participate through their employee donations and corporate PACs, it's not a lot of money in comparison to what these politicians are raising, either online or through other aspects like party fundraising. Companies probably before Citizens United actually had more power. Often people say, Citizens United gave, companies the right to, write unlimited checks to politicians. That is not true. Most companies do not do that. Almost all companies in the Fortune 500 have a prohibition and their own bylaws that say that they can't do that. It's also less political in a lot of ways. Policy is actually getting done In the Biden administration specifically, we've had some really big pieces of legislation go through in the last even 8 months, I would say, that are really instrumental to changing the way that the economy and the levers of government are going to work for people. And that is also true of even when it was the height of kind of polarization in the Trump administration, policy still went through. It often now comes in large packages. It does not come in piecemeal legislation, how it should. So you're often dealing with potentially 15, 20 issues at once. And I think that's very difficult to get from a European perspective. Mm-hmm. You might actually even be, this happens all the time, you might be for a bill as an organization, for a piece of legislation as an organization, and then it gets added to another piece of legislation that you do not like. That often happens because they try to make things must pass. They try to put legislation together with things that other people don't want, so that the industry is kind of on their back heels when they go to talk about that issue. Things like that, or they change it as an amendment. So I think for folks that are looking to just get started in the U.S., they have to realize that it can be incredibly kind of complex. It can be very fast moving in certain times. It can be, there's a lot of staff that work for individual members of Congress. It's not MEPs do not have a lot of individual staff. Most members of Congress have 20, and then, U.S. senators have 50 to 75. That is a lot of staff. So staff can drive the day on Capitol Hill. On the state level, it's a little bit harder. Yeah, I think sometimes we overstate how politicalized the U.S. can be in comparison to Europe, and I don't know always that is always the right perception there, because Europe is also fairly polarized, especially the country that I'm currently living in.
Mm-hmm. Right, thanks. And Joao, what of all those aspects just described by Nick, and anything else that might come to your mind based on your personal experience, what American approaches do you believe public effect Europeans could emulate and actually learn from?
Yeah, that was my one. I'm on mute free before the day. So what can Americans learn and emulate from Europeans? I would say
the question was the other way around, Joao. I think we already discussed what the U.S. can learn from us, but now it's a question of what do you think people on the Brussels side, in the Brussels bubble, can learn from those lobbying on the Hill?
Yeah, a lot of things, and vice versa. I think you have really great ideas and outstanding professionals. So many on both sides of the pond. What I see usually is, as with so many things, not just in public affairs, is that good practice is born out of necessity, right? The challenges, the big challenges, the political challenges facing Europe and the US at this point are actually quite similar. We had the Brussels Forum, the Brussels Public Affairs Forum happening last week, I want to say, or 2 weeks ago already. And we had a panel on transatlantic best practice on public affairs. And one of the conclusions of that discussion was precisely, how companies on both sides of the Atlantic are facing very similar challenge. It was the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions, the future of work. What does that mean for our staff? What does that mean for the way we engage with policymakers? Things are going more and more virtually in Europe, and I think in the US as well. At least that's what our council surveys are showing us. Virtual public affairs is much more used than it was before, and people are expecting it to continue. So you have that. You have obviously here in Europe, but I think in the US as well. The whole topic around sustainability and climate change and energy security. The war in Ukraine is obviously big, both in Brussels and the European capitals. And there's I think a global overall, let's say, geopolitical shift in the way Europe and the US are interacting with the rest of the world and the rest of other countries that are sometimes partners, sometimes competitors, and so that is really changing. So what I think is happening is at a tactical level, public affairs professionals are having to adapt to the different institutional setups that are indeed very different between Brussels and the US. One thing that I have found over and over again that European professionals and myself, I really admire about public affairs teams in the US is that, broadly speaking, people really understand how to measure the impact of public affairs and how to grasp that impact in numbers, in dollars and cents. It's measuring and communicating internally the value of your function, of the public affairs function, is about the question I get more often in my job here in the European office, and I see that in the US there is a very good grasp of how to measure this impact, how to quantify this, how do I think about the public affairs impact in business terms, and how can I communicate that in business terms to the other departments or to senior leadership. So I think that's one thing that is really interesting, and certainly a practice that in the US I think many people have really grasped.
Interesting. It's a really good one. Maybe hopefully we can discuss it further when we go to the Q&A. And speaking of the Q&A, I wanted to encourage everyone. We already have a few questions in the Q&A, but after this following question, we'll be taking all the questions from the floor. So I would really encourage everyone to start posting them either in chat or the Q&A. If you want to make them anonymous, you can post them in the Q&A. If not, you can also use the live chat. We'll be monitoring both. But from a final question for me, and it's for both of you, Nick and Joao, speaking about different approaches and works in the US, I wanted to ask you about grassroots advocacy. Why it works so well in the US, why it doesn't work in the EU, and if your thoughts and predictions, whether the kind of different are the current adaptation processes that are going on both sides to fit with this geopolitical shifts we've just been discussing, can predict any new developments in this area?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't like the I don't love the approach some organizations take where they view kind of grassroots as just as a tool, to be launched, when a lobbyist kind of needs it. I think it's in a lot of companies and associations and advocacy groups, it can be really a worthwhile program that sometimes is the leading part of it, and the lobbyists are more actually in a support role. That's kind of the organization that I've previously worked for, took that approach, is really leverage the members, the employees, those types of things. It obviously works really well in the United States. There are tons of studies that you can look at there about the effectiveness when you ask members of Congress who is the most influential when you're undecided on a position. It is the most influential stuff is hearing from their constituents. I'll say a couple things. State and federal and local all actually have a process to manage the influx of grassroots incoming emails, calls, all of those types of things. They come through and actually have a system. Need something. Is it better now?
Yeah,
okay.
It's better now.
They have people who take down those issues, who get back to folks who reached out. They have a whole process, an online system for gathering signatures, etc. While petitions are fairly common in the EU for different issues, like you said, there isn't a ton of grassroots that happens in near comparison. Part of that is people do not know who their MEP is. They have essentially, I don't know if you know who your MEP is. Literally most people don't. I don't think I've ever met someone that actually knew by name who their MEP is, right? So the chance of you contacting that individual is probably rare. Even when you look at a lot of states, it's difficult, sometimes because it's a parliamentary system, it is difficult to even know who your direct politician is. So that's a big thing. They don't have the infrastructure to respond. A lot of times you're emailing just their inbox, and they don't like that. And then I do think that they do things more, not deliberative, but there's less touch points for grassroots to occur in the way that the policy system is written. In the US, there are a lot of different kind of avenues and points where you really want to show that you have the constituent support there. And there's we do constituent work weeks when they go back into the district. Those are times when you want to show your influence. When the member of Congress or senator is back in the home district. Those are types of things that allow for a lot of close interaction. It is much harder here. And a lot of what you do see in terms of grassroots are only from very large companies that have kind of facing like existential threats. So the Googles of the world that had faced previously a pretty large threat from the EU. And I don't know how successful those efforts have really been.
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you.
My screen froze for a bit. So no, I agree. And Nick spoke a bit about the EU as well, and I think he was absolutely right when he spoke about the limitations for grassroots to happen in the EU. I think we're still waiting to see creative ideas of how to do grassroots at European level, and I would love to see those ideas and to actually have those ideas, actually materialize. There are barriers to that, of course. Most obviously, language is a barrier. Let's not forget that 70 years ago, Europe was at war with each other. These 27 countries, were at war with each other. Or some of them didn't exist, were part of other countries. They did not, of course, speak the same language. There was a very, very diverse political, cultural, economic. It was as diverse as it can be. So this is where we are coming from in the European Union. And the European Union has gone a long way, but I think to get there, to get to the sort of the grassroots movement that exists in the US, I think the institutional barriers that exist are still important, and you have a certain part of Europe which doesn't even believe in Europe. So it is Eurosceptic and doesn't want the European Union to actually exist. So that's going to make it obviously more difficult to mobilize people in different European countries. There is this an initiative you might know about it called the European Citizens Initiative. It allows petitions to be submitted to the European Commission, and the European Commission is then obliged to consider them, and not necessarily act on them, but consider them. But there are restrictions, or there are constraints. The petition needs to have more than 1 million signatures. It has to have a minimum number of signatures from at least 7 European countries, with obviously different languages and cultures and etc. And it needs to fall under the EU competences, which is also it's also an important question which not many people know. For many people, their own national governments are still the first and only entry point to politics. So there are obstacles, but I think it's certainly, as we have more Europe, and I do believe that we will have more Europe rather than less. People are going to be more and more aware of that, and they're going to realize, for example, in issues like tech that Nick was mentioning, people are going to be more and more aware that this is something that affects European consumers from across the spectrum of languages and cultures and nationalities, and there is more potential for mobilization.
Mm-hmm.
To just add a point that Joelle was making, I think the idea of those petitions is, that are happening, is kind of a reflection that Europe needed to be better at listening to folks. There were the yellow vest protests in Brussels the last time I was there, and a lot of it was about like, I don't feel like my voice is being heard in the EU. I feel like I don't have say, and that this is such a bureaucratic process, and I don't understand it, and I'm confused. And so I think on a number of areas, the EU has invested in reaching out much more heavily on communication campaigns on various topics, including the importance of the EU itself, and by soliciting, feedback. Obviously, you have similar issues in the U.S. when we had January 6th, where there was people that felt that their voice maybe wasn't being heard, and obviously contributed to essentially a terrorist attack in D.C. So it obviously is still there, even when you have the ability to reach out to your legislators, and those that are very easy in the U.S. But I think when you don't have it, it can even occur more often. I think when you have this kind of safety valves of I feel like my voice is at least being heard. Someone got back to me and said, "Thank you for sharing your opinion." And more EU legislators and bureaucrats are on LinkedIn and different things like that. So they are engaging with folks on social media as well.
Yeah. So I think it's safe to say that we're a little skeptical about the future of grassroots advocacy in the EU, even though we all seem to agree about the importance of developing more stable feedback channels with citizens, which, and of course, in itself is a bit of a contradiction. It would be interesting to discuss further. But in the interest of time, we've also had a lot of questions come in, so I would maybe switch to addressing them. And one of the first questions is addressed towards you, João, but Nick, please feel free to chime in. João, can you talk about how EU countries work together to advocate for policy priorities, because the needs of countries are quite different than needs of specific states?
If I had the answer to that question, I would probably have a much larger bank account. This is really one of the big questions here in Europe, and the European Union is, as I see it at least, is a negotiation machine. It's a machine that was created for people to talk and discuss, for countries to come together and have a forum to actually make decisions. That's why in the beginning of the institutions themselves, when the European Union was born, you've had many decisions that were expected to be taken by unanimity. We are going further and further away from that as the European Union grows, as reaching unanimity is perhaps a realistic possibility with 6 or 12 members. It's virtually impossible with 27. So, but the spirit of the institution or the institutions is still the same, which is to negotiate, is the process of give and take. And this is really how it works. You may have countries that are particularly favorable to a certain direction of policy, some countries that are, perhaps more interested in free trade, such as the UK when it was in the European Union, such as the Netherlands. The UK is gone. Free trade defenders now have one ally less, but other countries sometimes fill the void. Countries in Central and Eastern part of Europe, they favor a certain position when it comes to energy security, when it comes to defense, when it comes to the response to the war in Ukraine. Countries in the South and the West have a different opinion. So it's all a question of give and take. And it's obviously a complex process. Formally, all the countries come together in the European councils, which happen a few times per year, and that's when all the governments come together. Those are sort of the big strategic decisions, and then in the background, away from the spotlights, you have capitals working with each other and with Brussels to actually hammer out a lot of the daily legislative and policymaking work. But it's a complicated process. It's above all a negotiation process of give and take.
I think important part of that is also sometimes it's like what Joao said, is about being early in the EU is really important, I think, because these are such monumental kind of like almost diplomatic discussions. So it's hard to kind of constantly go back or remove something once so many parties have agreed to it. Where in the US, it's like, once an issue is passed, there's always kind of some way to change it. If you're a really good lobbyist, kind of an issue is never dead in America, where in the EU, if you get 27 countries to agree to something, at the end of the day, 'cause a lot of them have, a lot of issues have veto power over some of the big remaining issues.
I think we lost you for a second or two, Nick.
Yeah, sorry, Nick. I think we lost you for a sec, but I think the essence was that the bureaucratic red tape is always thick, but at some places it's a bit more thicker. But moving on to the next question, and feel free, either of you can take this one. And I think, Nick, you already touched upon this a little bit, but perhaps we could expand on it, is the US is exploring issues like antitrust, but it seems like the voices of our corporations are very heavily involved rather than just policy experts leading the conversation. Do companies have the same weight in the EU? And I think we did discuss this when we were talking about in terms of coalitions and associations versus individual companies, but maybe you have any additional insights to share?
Yeah,
I would say,
go ahead. Go ahead.
My perspective is they obviously don't have as much weight, if we want to be completely honest. It is definitely the results that you would expect in terms of how successful you are at influencing policy in the US. If you work at a company, the bar is much higher there, I think, internally at most companies than it is in the EU, because the EU is so insulated from political pressure, from influence from kind of companies in a lot of ways. That can be a good thing, and it can be a real bad thing, because if the issue is something that is potentially really complex, or it is something that there's some populism around, the wrong policy or a less preferred policy can obviously kind of continue to fester in the EU maybe a little bit longer than it would in the US. Think tanks have a lot more say, I think, in the EU and Brussels than they do in the US. Like, people think about think tanks a little bit in the US, but they're not nearly as strong as they are in the EU. And I think scholarship and academics come in a lot more in the EU than it does in the US. So having a white paper, having those types of really serious, hard-hitting data and background is much more, I think, impressive. That's kind of what I've seen as like the route, and so it definitely is obviously a little bit more wonkish. But Joao.
I think Nick is right, and made some good points. I will say this though. While I do agree that companies in the EU probably don't have the same weight, don't carry the same weight as they do in the US, I will say that having a more and more political European Commission or European Union also means that the institutions are becoming more and more aware that they won't be able to pull off something like the Green Deal, and they won't be able to address such a monumental file like sustainability and climate change without the support of business. So business really has to be on board. The companies really need to be on board in order for these things, so that these things can happen. And these are really the big files in town. This is really what the key things that that the EU is looking at today and for the future. And so I think there is an increasing awareness that without business, these files won't really move forward. I do think, and again, Nick stole my words when he mentioned the associations, and I think there is a question also about how American companies can work with their European counterparts. I think this to a good extent answers that question as well. Working through associations, and there are associations that have not just European but an international membership. And so it's a matter of you identifying which are the associations that are relevant to your industry, and then working through those associations, having a leading role. People always say that, always tell me that, especially leaders of associations themselves. They share with me that it's really important when companies assume a proactive role within the association, and they will then be able to take much more out of it, out of that membership. So definitely a difference, which you can certainly leverage as an opportunity if you do things, if you do things right, if you approach things from the sort of partnership and coalition building perspective.
Mm-hmm. And Nick, Joao just addressed this briefly, but maybe you could expand on the second question he was referring to, and if you have any examples of companies working well with their U.S. counterparts to achieve the same policy goals and how they are doing it.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of them. I'd say, the companies that have a global public policy team is often the ones that can do this the best. So meaning that they, you might have your kind of more relationship style lobbyists in a company, but then you will have a lot of big companies will have, a policy team as well that's separate, that just handles regulatory and policy structure. When they are done in a global way, where that policy is uniform across, and the policy experts will really understand across the world where these different issues sit at a given time, I think that can be really impactful versus kind of in one country lobbying for one thing and a different country lobbying for something slightly different because you think you can get away with a little bit more. Those things, that way of style of lobbying is kind of going away. I would also say it's really important to realize the realization that Europe is not as fast growing as the US, and the large companies that have done successfully, grown in the US are not necessarily European companies. You have a lot of tech that's in the US. You don't have as many tech companies in the EU. I'm talking about real big Fortune 500 companies. There's been a shift to a little bit more of a US-centric approach when it was fairly even maybe 25, 35 years ago. So it's important that if you are a big US company that's based there, even if you have a ton of dealings in Europe, that you show up and you say, okay, this is how we're really impacting the EU. This is how we're helping, grow EU jobs, those types of things. Because sometimes I think that those companies, the US-based companies, can look almost like enemies. This US company is doing really, really well, and they're going to kick our country's version of that, company out of business. It's often not the case. And so sometimes US companies can be demonized a little bit in the EU, and they need to kind of come with that perspective. And I think sometimes they don't realize that when they're walking in the door.
Yeah. Joao, anything to add? Or I think we have time to take one more question, and we have one that just recently came in. If you were to try an American-style lobby day in Brussels, what would work and what wouldn't work when compared to the efforts of those organizations in Washington? I think this is quite of a big, large-scale picture, but maybe we can take it as an opportunity to kind of summarize the key takeaways from this session of what would be something that you would give as an advice to your American colleague of one thing to learn from Brussels and one thing to avoid in Brussels.
Yeah, so I can go ahead. That's a very good idea, Mike. We might try it. So thanks for the idea. How it would work? I don't know. Well, I think one of the things we would see is bigger budgets, and I think Europeans would not complain. European lobbyists would probably not complain about that. On a more serious note, how it would look like, I think perhaps picking up on that grassroots conversation we were having just now, I think you might see a bigger conversation around how specific policies and legislation impact specific communities, impact constituents of different members of the European Parliament, if it is to the European Parliament that you would be talking to. I think you could see possibly campaigns being run not just in Brussels but also in other member states as well, with in the different diversity of languages that makes up the European Union. The same campaign or a similar campaign in France, another in Germany, another in Italy, taking into account the different perspectives and the different context of people in the different countries. So if I would have to take a wild guess at how that day would look like, I think these would be my first ideas. But maybe Nick, you're feeling more creative.
Well, I do think I think the EU loves thought leadership events, and there are a lot of those where it's a politician and a reporter, maybe from a news organization, on stage in front of a group of folks talking about a specific issue, and panels like that. And I think you could set them up as companies to then have a smaller, more intimate roundtable discussion after that, in a very practical sense. But I think something that Joao mentioned is, you have all these folks that are coming, that are in Brussels, that are coming from their countries. They have so many pressures back home, whether that's leadership. Most folks, right now don't love getting the Brussels assignment, and so they because it sometimes can be hard to transition out of that. To higher office as the president or something like that in their country. So working inside those countries, like Joao said, to really make sure that you have a really solid connection there, that whoever you're bringing to the fly-in, to the lobby day, is really rooted in that kind of understanding of, okay, this is where this person's coming from, this is the person we need to influence, and this is how I fit into that picture. That's very difficult to kind of do if you don't have a large footprint, if you're not in, all these countries. And I think that's part of it. That's part of it, is a lot of big companies operate with smaller footprints in some of these smaller European states.
Mm-hmm. We're just about time, but I would still like to give both Ira and Nick the opportunity to say a few closing words, any key takeaways, or any summaries, or any other additional comments you would like to make.
I just like to thank everyone for joining us. And, it's not as hard as one would think to get involved, whether you're a European trying to get involved in the US or vice versa. If we can be of help, this is something that I got a question the other day that said Brussels resources. We need resources to know how to deal. So Joao, you're going to get a member request from me. But it's something that occurs every day, because these two continents are actually becoming a lot closer. Which is it's a good thing to see. We're seeing this kind of Russia-China axis. It's only pushing us closer together, and so I think there's going to be a lot of room for collaboration in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. I mean, this transatlantic good ideas are at the heart of what we do at the council, and so I think this is certainly one of our favorite topics. So thanks to Nia and to Quorum for the invitation, and to everybody who joined. Yes, there are many good practices. There are many differences, tactical differences between the way public affairs is done in Europe and the US. From the political/strategic standpoint, the broad picture, I actually think there are a lot of similarities. So I would encourage you to, reach out to your European counterparts, see what they're doing, trying to get some tips, some lessons learned, and try to figure out ways to adapt that to your context. And same advice goes for the European people in attending the session. One certainly a very good thing that US needs to bear in mind, US professionals should bear in mind when they come to Brussels, is that coalition building. Work with your allies, try to figure out who can support you, and together you will go. I think you will go faster, actually. And like the proverb, I think you will go faster and you will go further. For Europeans, when you go to the US. Perhaps think about this really good practice that I find the U.S. professionals have, which is measuring and communicating internally the value of their work. Is not enough to do a good job. It's equally important to actually communicate that internally and enhance the profile and the reputation of your function, so that you'll have more resources, you'll have a larger team, and all of that. So a lot of things to learn, and Nia, over to you, and thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. So I would just say, as so eloquently demonstrated as by our conversation at the very start of the session, we might not agree on condiments, but we all agree that we like fries. So there's always common ground. But on that note, I would like to wrap up the session by once again thanking Nick and Joao for joining us today and sharing with us their interesting insights and public affairs practices from each side of the Atlantic. I would also like to thank everyone who joined us in the audience and asked questions and contributed to the discussion in the chats. As this session comes to a close, I would like to encourage you to take the spirit of friendly competition we explored today and apply it to the welcome trivia that is happening right after this session. It's a very fun way to get your brain a bit of a morning or late afternoon jolt, and also win some great prizes on offer while you're at it. To join, just navigate to the agenda page and you should see the option to join there. And while they're there, if you want to learn more about how Quorum can help you execute your public affairs strategy, no matter which side of the pond you are at, visit the exhibitions area, which is also located right next to the agenda, to get more information on our various features. And on that note, that's all from us today, and I'm wishing everybody a great rest of the day. Bye.